In the late 1930s, Germany stood on the edge of transformation. After the humiliation of World War I and the chaos of the Weimar years, the German people were desperate for hope, and one man seemed to offer it. His name was Adolf Hitler. To the generals of the newly rebuilt Wehrmacht, he appeared not as a politician, but as a visionary, a man who had somehow restored pride and purpose to a broken nation. When Hitler began to speak of expansion, of reclaiming German destiny, many within the military listened with admiration. They had seen what he had accomplished. Unemployment vanished, the army reborn, the nation unified under one flag. And when his lightning-fast invasions of Poland and France stunned the world, even the most skeptical officers were forced to admit, perhaps this man really was a strategic genius. Generals like Heinz Guderian, Walther von Brauchitsch, and Wilhelm Keitel had witnessed history being rewritten in months. The fall of France in just 6 weeks was something no German soldier had imagined possible. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, became the symbol of a new kind of warfare. Speed, surprise, precision. It seemed that Hitler's instincts defied the cautious, traditional thinking of old generals who still dreamed of trench warfare. At first, they marveled at his boldness. When Hitler ignored the doubts of his staff and ordered the invasion of the Low Countries, many feared disaster. But the result was spectacular. German panzers cut through enemy lines like a blade through paper. Paris fell, Britain was cornered, and across Europe, the name Hitler was whispered with both awe and fear. Inside the Wolf's Lair and the Reich Chancellery, the atmosphere was electric. Generals who once questioned his ideas now nodded in agreement, eager to please the man who never seemed to lose. Hitler's confidence became contagious. He would stride into briefings, slamming his hand on the table, declaring his vision with fiery certainty. "You think like old men," he would scold them. "War belongs to the bold." And time after time, the bold seemed to win. But beneath the surface, something darker was forming. Some officers noticed that Hitler often ignored intelligence reports or dismissed opposing views with fury. He trusted his intuition more than facts, his emotions more than strategy. Yet as long as victory followed him, few dared to speak against him. To challenge Hitler now meant to challenge the myth of the invincible Führer. By 1940, his word was law not just in politics but in the military. The traditional chain of command began to bend around his will. Field marshals who had once commanded entire fronts now waited nervously for approval from the man in Berlin. "The Führer knows best," they said. "He sees what others cannot." To the public, Hitler was a genius, the man who avenged Versailles and made Germany strong again. To his generals, he was becoming untouchable, a man whose instincts seemed blessed by destiny itself. And so, even as the first cracks of arrogance began to show, the military elite looked away. They convinced themselves that his victories were proof of his brilliance, not warnings of recklessness. No one wanted to admit it, that the same confidence that made Hitler rise would one day lead them all to ruin. For now they called him a genius, and the legend of that genius had only just begun. By the summer of 1941, the myth of Hitler's genius stood higher than ever. France had fallen, Britain was isolated, and the Führer's confidence had no limits. The generals watched as he prepared his greatest gamble yet, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On paper, it looked like another lightning victory. But behind the maps and speeches, unease began to spread through the ranks of Germany's high command. In the war rooms of Berlin, some of the most brilliant officers in the Wehrmacht, men like General Franz Halder and Heinz Guderian, began to question the plan. They knew the distances were vast, the logistics impossible, and the Soviet army far larger than Hitler imagined. But when they voiced their concerns, Hitler dismissed them with anger. "We have only to kick in the door," he said, and the whole rotten structure will collapse. Many generals were stunned by his arrogance. They had expected caution, analysis, and military reasoning. Instead, they found a man who trusted his gut above all else. He saw himself not merely as commander-in-chief, but as a prophet of destiny. When Halder tried to warn him about the dangers of the Russian winter, Hitler cut him off. The Russians are not trained for war. The campaign will be over in 3 months. First, it seemed he might be right again. The German army advanced hundreds of miles in weeks. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Hitler's belief in his own infallibility deepened. He began making direct tactical orders from hundreds of miles away, overriding his generals in the field. When his staff hesitated, he accused them of cowardice. "I know what victory demands," he would say. "You only know fear." But beneath the triumph, cracks were forming. Supplies were running short, vehicles broke down across endless Russian roads, and the soldiers, exhausted and frostbitten, began to understand what the high command had feared. The vastness of the Soviet Union swallowed their momentum. The front lines stretched too thin. Moscow was still far ahead, and winter was coming. Inside the headquarters, tension grew. Generals whispered in private that the Führer was losing touch with reality. Guderian pleaded to retreat and regroup before the cold destroyed the army. But Hitler exploded in rage. "Not one step back," he screamed. He refused to believe that the advance could fail. To him, retreat meant weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. By December, the German offensive had stalled. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Engines froze, rifles jammed, and men froze to death in their trenches. The Soviets counterattacked, pushing the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. It was a turning point, but Hitler refused to accept it. He accused his generals of betrayal, of lacking the will to fight. His blind faith in his own instincts was now destroying the army he had once inspired. In his private diary, General Halder wrote, "The Führer's decisions are no longer based on reason. He imagines things that do not exist. We are being led by a man who cannot be contradicted." For the first time, the myth of the genius began to crumble inside the minds of those who had built it. And yet, even then, few dared to confront him openly. They had seen what happened to those who questioned the Führer. To speak against him was to risk everything: position, honor, even life. So they remained silent, saluting a man they no longer believed in, as the snows of Russia buried the dream of German invincibility. The cracks in the armor were now visible, but no one yet realized how wide they would grow, or how completely they would shatter the empire he had built. By late 1941, the unstoppable German war machine had reached the gates of Moscow. The generals believed one final push would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. Soldiers could see the faint glow of the capital's lights in the distance. Victory seemed so close, but winter had arrived, and with it came a nightmare that no one in Berlin had prepared for. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. The tanks that had thundered across Europe now froze solid in the snow. Engines refused to start, oil turned to sludge, and weapons jammed in the icy air. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, scavenging for coats from fallen Russians. The 3-month campaign that Hitler had promised was turning into a slow death march through an endless white wasteland. Inside the Führer's headquarters, his generals pleaded for retreat. General Heinz Guderian warned that without rest and supplies, the Eastern Front would collapse. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch begged Hitler to allow his troops to pull back to defensible positions. But the Führer refused to listen. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "No retreat! The German soldier does not yield." To him, the suffering was proof of weakness, not a failure of strategy. He believed sheer willpower could defeat the Russian winter, and that the laws of nature would somehow bend to his determination. But nature does not obey dictators. As Soviet reinforcements poured into the front, fresh and well-equipped, the German line began to crack. For the first time in the war, the Red Army pushed the invaders back. Outside Moscow, entire divisions were shattered by relentless counterattacks. What Hitler called a pause before victory had become a full retreat in all but name. Yet, when reports reached Berlin, Hitler dismissed them as exaggerations. He was furious at his generals. He accused them of cowardice and incompetence. Those who suggested tactical withdrawals were replaced or demoted. "My will is the only command," he declared. The generals watched in silence as the man they once believed a genius turned the Eastern Front into a frozen graveyard. By December, more than 250,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Frostbite claimed more lives than Soviet bullets. Horses froze standing up, their bodies used as windbreaks for shivering troops. The mighty Wehrmacht, the pride of Europe, was now starving, freezing, and dying in the snow. In his diary, General Halder wrote with despair, "The troops can no longer fight. We are facing catastrophe, and the Führer refuses to see it." When officers tried to show Hitler aerial photographs of the retreat, he accused them of lying. He demanded that every soldier hold his position, even if surrounded. His orders turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. In Moscow, Stalin celebrated the first real German defeat. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered. Yet, in the bunkers and headquarters of the German command, fear kept everyone silent. No one dared to tell Hitler the truth. The dream of conquering the East had frozen to death in the snow outside Moscow. Still, in his speeches, Hitler promised victory. He told his people that spring would bring a new offensive, that the enemy's resistance is broken. His voice was calm, confident, even mesmerizing. But those closest to him saw the truth in his eyes. He no longer saw reality at all. The dream of empire, the dream of invincibility, all of it lay buried under the Russian snow. And as the smoke of burned villages rose into the gray winter sky, the generals began to understand that their leader was no longer fighting for victory. He was fighting against reality itself. By early 1943, the facade of Hitler's invincibility had begun to crumble. The once celebrated genius who defied his generals and conquered half of Europe was now consumed by anger and paranoia. Deep inside his mountain headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, he paced endlessly, barking orders that no longer made sense. His war, once guided by bold strategy, was now ruled by delusion. The turning point came at Stalingrad. It was there, on the banks of the Volga, that Hitler's obsession destroyed the Sixth Army. He had ordered General Friedrich Paulus to hold the city at all costs, even as the Soviets encircled them. The generals begged him to allow a breakout, but Hitler refused. "The Sixth Army will stand fast," he shouted. "Not one step backward." As winter closed in, the trapped soldiers starved and froze. When Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, Hitler was furious. "He should have shot himself," he said coldly. To him, suicide was loyalty, surrender was treason. It was the clearest sign yet that the Führer no longer saw his men as human beings, only as pieces in his ideological war. In the months that followed, Hitler's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Those who visited him noticed his trembling hands, his pale, sleepless eyes, and his explosive mood swings. He no longer trusted anyone, not even his closest officers. Conversations became rants. He accused generals of plotting against him, of deliberately sabotaging his plans. "Everyone lies to me," he screamed. Meetings inside the Wolf's Lair turned into spectacles of fear. Maps were covered with arrows and symbols that no longer reflected reality. When his staff tried to point out Soviet advances, Hitler slammed his fist on the table. "Nonsense," he barked. "My intuition tells me the Russians are exhausted. Victory is near." But his intuition had long since betrayed him. Some generals, like Erich von Manstein, still tried to reason with him, proposing tactical withdrawals and flexible defenses. Hitler's reply was pure stubbornness. "I am the greatest military leader in history. I will not allow cowards to question my genius." Behind his back, officers whispered that the Führer was no longer sane. Field Marshal Kluge confided to a colleague, "He lives in another world now, one where facts do not exist." Yet open defiance remained impossible. Those who dared to contradict him, like General von Witzleben, were dismissed or sent to meaningless commands. The circle around Hitler grew smaller, tighter, more devoted to his illusions. He surrounded himself with yes-men, Keitel, Jodl, and others who echoed his fantasies instead of confronting him. They nodded while he spoke of wonder weapons and divine destiny. The air inside the bunker grew heavy with fear and fanaticism. In private, Hitler raged against imaginary enemies, Jews, traitors, and defeatists, blaming everyone but himself. He spoke for hours, his voice shaking with fury, promising that Germany would rise again through sheer will. But outside, the Reich was burning, and his armies were bleeding on every front. By the end of 1943, even his most loyal generals knew the truth. The Führer's mind had turned against him. His arrogance had become madness. His certainty, a curse. Yet still they obeyed, terrified of what defiance would bring. In the quiet moments between his outbursts, Hitler would stare blankly at his maps, whispering to himself about destiny and betrayal. The man who once inspired millions now lived in a world of ghosts, haunted by the victories he could never repeat, and by the empire that was slowly collapsing beneath him. The madness had taken hold, and from this point on it would only grow darker. By the summer of 1943, the Third Reich stood at a crossroads. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht was bleeding, and the once unshakable confidence in Hitler had begun to fade. Yet the Führer refused to accept reality. He still believed that sheer willpower and faith could reverse the tide. His generals, watching in disbelief, began to understand that the man they once called a genius was slipping into madness. The new offensive at Kursk was meant to be Germany's redemption, a massive tank assault that would crush the Soviet army once and for all. Hitler poured his remaining strength into the plan. Over 3,000 tanks, hundreds of thousands of men, and the Reich's last reserves of fuel were gathered for one decisive blow. But even before the first shot was fired, his generals warned that the enemy was ready. Soviet defenses were deep and heavily fortified. The element of surprise was gone. Hitler ignored them. He delayed the attack for weeks, obsessed with waiting for his newest weapon, the Tiger and Panther tanks, to arrive. Those delays gave the Soviets even more time to prepare. When Operation Citadel finally began in July 1943, it turned into a slaughter. German armor was trapped in minefields, ambushed by Soviet guns, and bombed from above. Within days, the great offensive collapsed. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of German initiative in the east. For the first time, the Red Army began pushing the invaders back. Not in inches, but in miles. The dream of victory was over. Yet Hitler refused to admit defeat. "The Russians are finished," he insisted, pounding the table as reports of retreat came in. "We will strike again." His commanders watched with growing alarm. Field Marshal Manstein begged for a controlled withdrawal to save what was left of his army. Hitler's response was pure rage. "You will hold your ground. The German soldier does not retreat. He conquers or he dies." Behind the scenes, despair spread through the officer corps. In private, some whispered that the Führer had lost his mind. He spoke of phantom divisions that didn't exist, of miracle weapons that would soon change the course of history. His conferences became unpredictable, sometimes calm and hypnotic, other times filled with shouting, shaking hands, and violent outbursts. Even those who once adored him began to turn away. Field Marshal Kluge confided, "He no longer trusts anyone. He lives in a world of illusions." Generals who questioned him were dismissed, humiliated, or transferred. The Wehrmacht was no longer led by strategy, it was ruled by fear. At night, Hitler withdrew deeper into isolation. He studied maps obsessively, redrawing battle lines that no longer existed. He demanded total loyalty while giving orders that defied logic. As the front lines collapsed, his speeches to the German people grew more desperate, promising final victory even as the Allies bombed Berlin. In 1943 and 1944, the illusion of control became the foundation of his insanity. His generals now saw it clearly. He was no longer leading Germany toward triumph, but toward destruction. Some began to plot in secret, quietly speaking of saving the nation from its leader. But within Hitler's mind, the idea of defeat was unthinkable. Every failure was someone else's fault, the generals, the weather, the traitors, the Jews, never him. He truly believed that his destiny was divine and that only betrayal could stop him. The turning point had come. The Wehrmacht no longer fought for victory. It fought for survival, trapped between the enemy in front of them and the madness behind them. And as the smoke of Kursk cleared, one truth became undeniable to every German general. Their Führer was no longer a genius. He was a man at war with reality itself. By early 1944, the German High Command was no longer united by loyalty but by fear. The war that had once promised glory had become a nightmare of endless defeat. Cities were burning, armies were crumbling, and the man who had led them to power now seemed intent on leading them all to ruin. Among the officers, a quiet rebellion began to take root, a desperate hope to save Germany from its own leader. The seeds of that rebellion had been planted years earlier, after the first disastrous campaigns in Russia. Men like Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, General Ludwig Beck, and Hans Oster had begun to question everything they once believed. They were patriots, not traitors, men of honor who had sworn an oath to serve their country. But the oath to Hitler now felt like a chain around their necks. By 1944, they had seen too much. The massacres in the East, the slaughter of civilians, the executions of prisoners. These were not the acts of soldiers, but of a regime descending into madness. Stauffenberg, once a loyal believer, had lost an eye and a hand fighting for Germany. Now, scarred and hardened, he became convinced that removing Hitler was the only way to save what remained of the nation. The conspirators gathered in secret, in dimly lit apartments, behind closed doors in Berlin, and even in the barracks of the Army High Command. They called their plan Operation Valkyrie. Officially, it was designed to secure order in case of internal unrest. In truth, it would be the tool to overthrow Hitler himself. Their plan was daring, almost unthinkable. Assassinate the Führer and use the reserve army to seize control of Berlin before the SS could react. Every step had to be perfect. Every word, every order, rehearsed in whispers. Failure meant death, not just for them, but for their families. Yet, as the plot grew, so did the paranoia inside Hitler's circle. He had begun to sense disloyalty everywhere. He trusted no one, not even his closest staff. His rages became more frequent, his decisions more erratic. Generals were dismissed for imagined insults. Officers were arrested without cause. Still, the conspirators pressed on, believing that time was running out. In June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. The Western Front had finally opened, and Germany was now fighting on every side. Stauffenberg knew the moment had come. If they waited any longer, there would be nothing left to save. The plan would be set in motion at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters in East Prussia. For months, they prepared the smallest details. Explosives were smuggled, detonators modified, timing rehearsed again and again. Even those who doubted the plan's chances joined in, moved by desperation rather than hope. Better to die trying, one officer whispered, than live to see Germany destroyed. Still, there was hesitation. Killing Hitler was not just treason, it was a moral and spiritual crisis. Some officers feared divine punishment. Others feared civil war. But the reality of defeat and the endless stream of orders to fight to the last man hardened their resolve. As the date approached, Stauffenberg confided in his aide, "A man must choose between his conscience and his duty. I will do both for Germany." By July 1944, the seed of rebellion had grown into a fragile but determined movement. Officers, diplomats, and even members of the general staff were ready to act. They would risk everything, their rank, their families, their lives, to stop the man who had once seemed unstoppable. But deep inside the Führer bunker, Hitler remained oblivious. He still believed himself untouchable, chosen by destiny. His grip on reality slipped further each day. Outside, the Reich was collapsing. Inside, he clung to delusions of victory. The conspirators knew the truth. The time for words had passed. Action was the only path left. And so, in the shadows of July 1944, as the thunder of war echoed across Europe, they made their final preparations. The moment of decision was coming, and soon the world would witness the day when German officers dared to strike against their own Führer. It was the morning of July 20th, 1944. Inside the dense forests of East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair buzzed with tension. Hitler was scheduled to meet his staff in a wooden conference hut, a routine briefing on the war that was slowly destroying Germany. But among the officers arriving that morning was one man carrying not just papers, but a bomb. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg had come to kill the Führer. He had prepared for this moment for months. Every movement rehearsed, every second planned. With one functioning eye, one hand, and two missing fingers, he adjusted his briefcase carefully. Inside was a block of British-made plastic explosive, fitted with a time detonator. It was his weapon, his hope, and perhaps Germany's last chance for salvation. As the meeting began around 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg stood near the center of the room. The air was stifling. Hitler leaned over a large oak table covered with maps of the Eastern Front, explaining how the Russians were nearly finished. Stauffenberg knew it was a lie. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly. But he said nothing. He excused himself, pretending to take a phone call, and quietly placed the briefcase beneath the table, just a few feet from Hitler. Moments later, he left the room. As he walked away, the seconds ticked down. He climbed into his car, his heart pounding. At 12:42 p.m., a thunderous explosion ripped through the conference hut. Flames and debris erupted into the air. The blast shattered windows, splintered wood, and threw men across the room. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed real. Hitler was dead. Stauffenberg raced toward the airfield, convinced the mission had succeeded. He contacted Berlin. "The Führer is dead. Operation Valkyrie begins." The conspirators in the capital sprang into action. Orders were sent to arrest SS leaders, to seize government buildings, to take control of radio stations. The coup had begun. But the victory was an illusion. The bomb had failed to kill Hitler. The heavy oak table had shielded him from the full force of the blast. Though 4 men were killed, Hitler survived with only minor injuries. His eardrums ruptured, his trousers torn, but his fury intact. In Berlin, Confusion spread like wildfire. Hours passed and no confirmation came. Then, around 6 p.m., a radio broadcast shattered their hopes. "Mein Führer, you are alive!" cried a voice. And then Hitler himself spoke, trembling but triumphant, declaring that Providence had saved him from a cowardly attack. The conspirators' courage turned to terror. Loyal officers hesitated, unsure who was in control. SS units quickly surrounded the Bendler Block, the army headquarters in Berlin. By midnight, the coup had collapsed. Stauffenberg, once hailed as a hero among his men, was arrested, beaten, and brought before a firing squad in the courtyard. His final words echoed through the darkness. "Long live sacred Germany!" By morning, the rebellion was over. Hundreds were arrested. Over the next weeks, nearly 5,000 people were executed. Officers, clerks, even distant relatives of the conspirators. The Gestapo filmed many of the hangings on piano wire to show Hitler the price of betrayal. Yet, even in failure, the July 20th plot became a symbol, a final act of conscience in a nation consumed by fear. These men had not fought for power or revenge. They fought for Germany's soul. Hitler, meanwhile, emerged more paranoid than ever. He no longer trusted anyone. Meetings were shorter, his security doubled, and he demanded constant proof of loyalty. The failed assassination only deepened his belief that he was chosen by destiny, that nothing could destroy him. But deep down, the truth was clear. The regime had crossed a line it could never return from. The day they tried to save Germany was also the day Hitler sealed its doom. From that moment, every German officer knew there would be no more turning back, no more miracles, and no escape from the coming collapse. The bomb had failed to kill him, but it had exposed him to his people, to his generals, and to history itself.